is right around the corner, and I put together a mega video of all of my favorite Dollar Tree DIY crafts to help get inspired for the new season of crafting. I had searched through all of the plastic planters that they had at the Dollar Tree, but I couldn't really find one that I really liked the shape. So over in the bathroom section, I ended up finding this plastic garbage can, and it was perfect for what I needed. You can see here, it's about 8.5 inches tall, and it really doesn't get much wider at the top than it is at the bottom. I'm also going to be using one of these sand dollars from the Dollar Tree and some nautical rope. About 1.5 inches up from the bottom of my garbage can, I took a nail file and I just roughed up the surface a bit. This plastic's pretty shiny, and I was afraid that my hot glue wouldn't stick very well to it. I laid down just a small amount of hot glue, and that's where I started my nautical rope. I wasn't sure exactly how much rope was in this roll, and my initial idea was that I was just going to wrap until I ran out of rope, but as I was wrapping, I realized I had way more rope than what I realized, so I just kept wrapping until I had a few inches built up, just so that it was taller than the sand dollar that I was using. Once I had all of my rope in place, and I was really careful to make sure that I was stacking the rope on top of each other, there wasn't any gap in between each of the rows. But once I got to the height that I like, I grabbed that nail file again and I gave it another little roughing so that my hot glue would stick. And I did lay hot glue down for the last 2 rows just to make sure that everything would be held in place really well. I also made sure that where I ended my row was where I started it, so that that could be the backside of my planter. I debated which way I wanted my sand dollar to face. The one side kind of made more sense because it bubbled out a bit, but the other side had a lot more detail on it, so I decided to stick that side facing outward. I used that nail file again to rough up the surface just to make sure my glue would stick, because I wasn't sure if this was plastic or plaster. Next, I had to switch camera angles here so that you could see a little bit better. Here's my finished planter. You can see it's quite big and quite deep. So I grabbed some river rock. I always get these from the Dollar Tree, and I placed a good amount in the bottom just to make it a little bit more sturdy and secure. And then I also had a piece of floral foam that I cut to fit inside of my planter. I laid that on top, and then I have this really big bunch of leaves. I think these are Monstera leaves. And I went back and forth. I wasn't sure how many of these leaves would look good in this planter. I originally clipped off 3 and stuck those in. Then I added another 2, and I realized that looked a little messy and overcrowded. So then I went back to just the 3 leaves. It's really up to you. I also think that some of that breezy pampas grass would look really pretty in a planter like this. And then once I had my leaves in place, I used the rest of the river rock and I placed it over the top just to cover up the floral foam. Watermelon is one of my favorite summer fruits, and I love all of the watermelon items they have at the Dollar Tree. I wanted to make a picnic caddy because my family gets together a lot over the summer, so I grabbed one of the watermelon themed charger plates they have, and I also grabbed 3 of these coordinating glasses. I love the red color on them, and I really like the iridescent finish they have to them. Even though these glasses are pretty just how they are, I really wanted to lean into the watermelon theme. I started with some white chalk paint and I went about 1/3 of the way up the glass, or right where it started to curve. And I'm using this white chalk paint for part of my watermelon design, but I'm also using it as a primer because sometimes paint gets a little bit sheer and I want it to be more opaque on this glass. So I am going to go in with some other colors, but I figured I would start with the white first to act as a base. I went around the outside of the glass, and you can see here I wasn't trying to create a straight line. I wanted it to flow a little bit better around the outside of the glass. So there are some wiggles and some lumps and bumps, but I feel like it just made it look more like a watermelon. I gave each of my glasses 2 coats of the white chalk paint, and after it was all dry, I went in with some green. I'm using the apple barrel paint here in a matte finish, and this one is called Arbor Green. Now I'm going to try my best to follow the same wiggle bumpy pattern that I did on the white coat, but I'm staying about 1/8 of an inch down from the top. So the white is going to act as the rind of the watermelon, and now I'm painting on my dark green color. So you can see here, I'm just following the line as best as I can. It doesn't have to be perfect because no watermelon is. And for all of the paints that I did have to do 2 coats. So like I said, I gave it 2 coats of the white paint, and then once my first coat of the green was in, I realized it looked a little streaky, which is okay because watermelon tends to be a little streaky, but I wanted more of a coverage, so I did go through with the same dark green and gave it a second coat. And like I said, I'm doing the same thing to all 3 of the glasses. You can see here, after my second coat of green dried, you could see some of the white through it, which I felt gave it more of a realistic look. Then to create some of the lines in the watermelon, I went in with a lighter green color. This is also by Apple Barrel in a matte finish, and it's called Crisp Green. I have a really flat paintbrush here, and I'm just dabbing it into that lighter green color, and I'm just pouncing it onto the bottom of my glass to create the stripes that a watermelon would naturally have. Now on the camera here, it looks a bit bright, but when the paint was all dry, that green did dull down a bit, and it made it look more realistic. So you can see here, I did all 3 of my glasses like that, and since I've been handling them, they have some of the oils from my fingers on them. So before I went on to the next step, I just used some rubbing alcohol to remove all of their oils. Now I took my Sharpie paint pen in black, and I wanted to create a few seeds on my glass, so just doing a teardrop shape in different spots around the glass. I didn't try to do a pattern here. I was just making them as random as I could, and I turned them in different directions, and I spaced them out uneven so it would look more like a watermelon. I went about another third up of the glass. I didn't want to fill in the whole red section with seeds, but I did want there to be a few on there to look like a real watermelon. After my paint was dry on all 3 of the glasses, I laid them out in the center of my plate, and I wanted to use some E6000 here so that I would have a really strong bond between the 2 plastics. I also used some hot glue just to have that short-term hold. So I went around where the raised part of the glass was, where I knew it would touch the plate, and that's where I'm putting my E6000. And then right in the very center of the glass is where I added my hot glue just so that it would have a quick hold. Then I placed everything back down on the charger plate so that it was in the center. I found these cute watermelon napkins at the Dollar Tree, and they also had packs of plasticware in a dark green and a light green that matched perfect. I know sometimes the Crafter's Square section can get pretty thin. They don't always have a lot of supplies, but one thing I can always find at Dollar Tree are these mini pallets. I wanted to create some solar lights to set on the picnic table outside of our camper, so I grabbed 8 of these mini pallets and also 2 of the solar lights from the Dollar Tree. They have a bunch of different colored tops, but I went with the bronze color. Sometimes when I'm creating box shapes, I find it's really hard to get the corners right. So I laid my T-square down, and there's not a lot of surface area on these pallets to add glue to, but I was able to add some hot glue to 2 of the crossbars, and when I tucked it into the corner of my T-square, it gave it a nice square shape. Now I use the Gorilla Glue sticks here, and I've always had good luck on wood with these. They always have a good hold for me, but if you haven't had good luck, you might want to try using some wood glue here. Sometimes I do a wood glue, hot glue combination, but like I said, since there wasn't a lot of space on the palette, I didn't have enough room to add both glues. In order to make my box even more sturdy, I went through and added hot glue in each of the corners on the inside just for a little extra security. Since there were crossbars on the inside of the palette at the top and bottom, I was able to add glue to both sides, and that really held this up. I even set this outside to charge the solar lights up, and it's been really hot here in PA, and none of my glue came apart. I needed to create a base for at the base of my solar light. I have these wood squares in my stash. I'm not even sure where they came from. Maybe Amazon, maybe Temu. They're super thin, but they're 5x5 squares, and they were a little too big to fit inside of my solar light. I measured mine, and I cut mine down to 4 1/4 by 3 3/8 of an inch, but I would take a measurement of your own first just to make sure that it'll fit inside. And again, because those crossbars are inside the palette, this was able to slip right inside and just sit on top of those. Now these solar lights come in a few pieces. There's always a tab here, so if you want to check yours before you leave the store, you can pull that tab out, and if you put your hand over the top, you can see if it works or not. I'm not going to need the stake part of the solar light, so I just took that off. And using a combination of E6000 and hot glue, I wanted to make sure that this was really sturdy on that base that I had created out of that piece of really thin wood. So I'm using the E6000 at the bottom of the solar light, and I placed it in the middle. I held it there for just a second, and then I got my hot glue out and I started really piling it on around the outside just to make sure that it had that long-term, short-term hold. And like I said, I added a lot of hot glue around the edges here so that it would have a little bit of a buildup and be more sturdy. Now the tricky part with this is you have to let it sit for a little bit so that that hot glue has a chance to cool so that it doesn't wobble over. And you can see even after the light is connected to that platform, it slips inside of that box really easily. And this is great too because if something happens to that solar light, it can easily be replaced. Now there's a ton of different ways that you could choose to decorate yours. You could even leave just the natural wood because I do think that these palettes are a really pretty natural color, but I wanted to darken mine up a little bit and have more of a rustic feel. I'm using the Antique Wax by Waverly. A lot of times I like to apply this with a baby white because it kind of eliminates a step, but I really wanted a deep dark stain this time, so I'm applying it with a paintbrush, and this is also helping me get into the nooks and crannies. This took a little bit of time because there are so many small spaces, and I really wanted to cover everything, including the inside of this, so that none of that light wood would show through. Now, if you don't want to take the time to do this, like I said, you could leave the wood plain, or you could spray paint it, and I think it would help get into those nooks and crannies a little bit easier. And you can see I did go through with a baby wipe, taking off some of the extra, and I did go through and start applying it with the baby wipe, but once I realized it wasn't quite dark enough for me, I went back through with the paintbrush again and applied a little bit more. Once my stain had a chance to dry, I took some white chalk paint and I started dry brushing over the edges. I concentrated more of the paint on the top and the bottom of the box, and I just ran it lightly through the center. This gives it that distressed look that I really like. I wanted to give my box a little more character, so I dug around in my craft stash and I found some of these little stencils that have leaves and flowers on them. I took one of the stencils that has just a few leaves lined up, and using that same white chalk paint, I'm going to stencil over the box the whole way around to essentially create a border using this little mini stencil. Now, because I'm not afraid of a little bit of paint getting under my stencil and having the edges look a little blurred, I didn't bother taping this stencil down. I was just holding it in place with my fingers and pouncing the paint onto the stencil to bring out that design. Now, if you'd like more of a clean design, you might want to think about actually taping the stencil in place and then really taking your time as you're applying that paint. But like I said, I don't mind if it has a little bit of blurred edges. I think that looks really good. And I really like the monochromatic look of having the box distressed with the white chalk paint and then also having the stencil done in the same chalk paint. Even though it's the same color, it looks different because it's thicker when you put it on with the stencil. So once I had the border created the whole way around the box, then I went through with that single leaf and I just added a few in the corners of each side. You could pay over $100 for this set of 3 plant hangers, but with a few things from the Dollar Tree, you can make it for a lot less. I grabbed one of these oval tins that you can find at the Dollar Tree. They usually have these year-round, but they especially have them now that it's garden time. I grabbed 2 of the peel and stick tiles, and you can see the pattern on these is almost exactly like the Kirkland's ones. And I also grabbed one of the plant hangers that you can find out now. I have this tool in my craft stash. It's by We Are Memory Keepers. It's called a Dile, and it's a great way to poke holes through things that are a little bit thicker, like tin or chipboard or things like that. You can see it makes a really nice hole there. So I needed to poke 2 holes on one side and 1 hole on the other, since this plant hanger does have 3 chains coming down from it. If you don't have this tool, you could use a hammer and nail and just hammer through, just so that the hole's big enough to fit the hook from the plant hanger through. I wanted to get a better idea of the shape of this tin, so I grabbed my roll of craft paper and I just laid it over the tin and pressed down on it so that it would give me an idea of what kind of shape I needed to cut out of the peel and stick tile. If I would have just laid the tile right over top of it, it would have buckled slightly. So I needed to get the correct curve in order for the tile to fit on it more properly. I'm using a pencil here to sketch out the 2 lines that I created just so that you can see it a little better. And then I just cut that shape out with my scissors so that I could transfer it onto the peel and stick tile. I kept the adhesive backing on the back side of the tile because I didn't want my paper to stick to it. And I'm tracing from the back side. You can see I moved the line up a little bit. The first time I traced it, it was in the wrong spot, so I had to move it up. This tile is really easy to cut through. It's a very thin plastic. It's 2 layers, so I was able to cut through it with no problem with just my regular scissors. And at first I thought I was going to need 2 tiles for this tin because I didn't think that I would be able to get 2 strips of the same size out of 1 tile. But it turns out that there was enough space on 1 tile that I was able to take this same first piece that I used and just trace it again on the same tile so that I could have 2 pieces, 1 for the front side and 1 for the back side. And you can see the tile is 2 pieces and it's only connected on the edges. So I did lay just a little bit of hot glue down through the center so that the 2 pieces were connected and they wouldn't flop around. It can be a little tricky getting things to attach to metal like this, so I started with some E6000 glue and I just added a bit on the front side of my tin. I used a craft stick to smooth it out so there weren't any large clumps or bubbles, and then I peeled the backing off of the peel and stick tile and laid it over top. I also went through with some hot glue on the very edges of the tile just to make sure that everything was really held in place. So essentially we have 3 different types of adhesive on here, so I don't think this tile is going to go anywhere. Now you can see once I had the tile laid over the tin, there was some excess, and because this tile is so easy to cut, I just went through with my scissors and cut off any of the overhang. Once I had the tile pieces on both the front and back side of the tin, I went back through with my crocodile tool again, and because I could see where I had already punched those holes, I could line it up and punch it again. Unfortunately, this tile was not long enough to go the whole way around the tin, and I didn't really care for how it looked on the sides where the 2 tiles didn't quite overlap. So to remedy that, I decided to cover it up with something else. I cut off some of the excess tile first because it was a bit bulky on the sides, and then I used some hot glue just to glue down both pieces of the tile to make sure that it was nice and flat. Before moving on to the sides, I wanted to give my planter that aged distress look, so I'm using some white chalk paint and a chippy brush, and I'm doing a pretty heavy coat. I wanted a lot of the white to show through and to really show off the pattern on this tile. I found some burlap ribbon in my stash that had some pretty lace running through it, and it was the perfect width to cover up that spot where those tiles didn't meet. So I did a bit of hot glue to the bottom of the planter, and then I held the ribbon in place with the glue and some clear tape. I ran some glue up the sides, and you can see it's the perfect width to cover up both of those raw edges from the tile. Then I just needed to add some hot glue towards the inside of the planter, tuck my ribbon into it, and keep it secure with another piece of clear tape. I think the planter looks good as is, but since I added the burlap ribbon to the sides, I wanted to pull some of that color through the front of the planter also. I have this really thin jute rope that I got from Amazon, and I just did a small bead of hot glue around the bottom of the planter and laid the rope into it, and then I repeated that on the top. This not only pulled that color from the burlap through the planter, but it also helped cover up any of the raw edges from where I had cut the tile. Before adding any flowers to my planter, I wanted to attach this plant hanger. It was really easy with the clips provided. And if you didn't want to use this as a hanging planter, you could use it as a standalone centerpiece also. I had this sign in my stash from the fall. It's shaped like a cutting board, and I wanted to give it a makeover using the peel and stick wallpaper. I really love this butterfly pattern that they have out now, and when I went over to the sticker section in the Dollar Tree, I found blue butterfly stickers that coordinated really well with the wallpaper. On the back side of my cutting board, I started by taking my ruler and I measured about 5 inches up from the bottom. I used some pencil to create a line, and then I took some washi tape, or you could use painter's tape here, and I just covered up over where that line is so that it would give me a guide as to what section I needed to paint. Once my washi tape was in place, then I just used some chalk paint and I gave it 2 coats. I forgot to press record here, but I did cut a piece of that wallpaper down so that it was just a little bit bigger than the section I needed on the cutting board, and then I peeled the backer off and laid it down on the cutting board where I didn't paint. Once I had that in place, then I flipped it over and I used my little utility knife and I just cut all of the excess away. It was really hard to choose, but I picked 4 of the butterflies that I liked the most out of the sticker pack. Actually, a few of those are dragonflies too, and I laid them out on the cutting board just so I could see how they would fit in the white area. I didn't press them down, I just laid them lightly so that I could get a good idea of the spacing. Once I liked how they were laid out, I wanted to make sure that these would stick really well, so I did go back through with a little bit of wet glue. I like to use the art glitter glue, but you could use Mod Podge or tacky glue here, and I just wanted to make sure they would stick down really well, so I did add some of that glue onto the backside before I laid them down permanently. Recently, I was in Hobby Lobby and I found a bunch of ribbon rolls on clearance, which I was so excited about. Give me a big thumbs up if you would be excited too. I grabbed one of the rolls that had blue and white stripes on it, and using some hot glue, I just glued it across the front where the white and the peel and stick wallpaper meet. I only kept my hot glue on the sides because I didn't want it to seep through the ribbon. Once I had it in place, then I flipped the whole thing over and used more hot glue on the back to tuck the edges around. As a final touch for my cutting board, I gathered up a bunch of greenery that I had in my stash, and using the hole at the top of the cutting board, I was able to determine where the center was, so I just started laying pieces of greenery in a cute little bundle along the center, and then I used that same blue and white striped ribbon to create a simple bow, and I hot glued that on top. I thought these metal fish were really neat. They're meant to be hung on a wall, but I'm going to use them for something else. I'm not crazy about this gold color, but that's what paint is for, right? In addition to 2 of the fishes, I also grabbed 2 of these scalloped candle holders. I really like the design on these, and I think they're perfect the way they are, so I'm not going to do anything to those. And then I'll just need to use 2 dowel rods. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know that I love Waverly chalk paint. But a lot of you have told me that you have a hard time finding it in your Walmart, and the last time I was in my Walmart, I couldn't find any of certain colors, like white, which is one of the colors that I use the most of. So I hopped over to Michael's to see if I could find an alternative. I grabbed their store brand chalk paint, which is the Craft Smart brand, to give it a try. Now, when I first poured it out, I thought it seemed like it was about the same thickness as the Waverly chalk paint, and as I was painting these fishes, it seemed like the coverage was about the same also. Now, metal can be tricky to paint. It usually takes more than 1 coat, which I was expecting anyway. And after I had the first coat on, I could see some of the brush strokes in it, but that happened with my Waverly paint also. I took my heat gun to these to dry them a little bit faster, and I felt like it dried about the same as the Waverly. So all in all, I feel like this is a good alternative to the Waverly chalk paint if you can't find it where you live. I compared the prices between the Craft Smart and the Waverly, and they were about the same price. The Craft Smart was $12.79 for a 16-ounce jar, and the Waverly was around $12.47 for a 16-ounce jar. But at Michael's, I did have a 20% off coupon for anything that was regular priced. So once that coupon came off, it took it down to $9.59. I wanted to share this with you just to help you out in case you're looking for an alternative to the Waverly chalk paint. Now you can see after my first coat of chalk paint dried, you could still see a lot of the streaks from the paintbrush. Like I said, that's pretty normal when you're painting on metal. But to counteract that, what I like to do on my second coat is instead of brushing it over the surface, I like to tap it on. That way it'll fill in any of the deeper cracks between some of the brush strokes, and I feel like it gives it more of a plaster or ceramic look once it's dry. It might be a little hard to see on camera, but once my second coat was dry, I really felt like it had a nice ceramic look to it. And I did forget to mention that I also painted those two dowel rods with the same paint also. Because these fish are concave, I needed a better surface to attach my dowel rods to the backside. So I grabbed some of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I laid one in the center, but it still wasn't quite tall enough for my dowel rod to reach it. So then I started cutting apart a craft stick just to build it up a little bit more so that I could lay my dowel rod on it. So I found with these fish that 2 pieces of a craft stick and a Jenga block worked the best in order to give me a better surface to attach my dowel rod to. Now, to glue the 3 wooden pieces together, I'm just using hot glue. Because I do use the Gorilla Glue sticks, they seem to work really well on wood. I also used hot glue to attach my dowel rod to the 3 builder pieces, and then I just used a piece of clear tape to hold everything in place. You might notice that for the first one, I hot glued the dowel rod right to the top of the tumbling tower block, but for my second fish, I wanted it to sit a little bit lower than the first one. So once I had my piece in place on my fish, rather than gluing my dowel rod to the top of the builder piece, I glued my dowel rod down slightly. So you can see there at the top of the screen, the first one, the top of the dowel rod goes right to the top of the tumbling tower block, but on this second one, it extends over a little bit, and that'll just help change the height between the 2 fishes. Metal can be tricky whenever you're trying to add glue to it, so I'm going to use a combination of E6000 and hot glue. I started by putting just a dot of the E6000 right in the center of both of my fishes. Then I grabbed one of my dowel rod pieces, and you can see I'm just adding a dot of hot glue to the top and the bottom of the tumbling tower block piece. That way none of the adhesive would cross together, but the hot glue will give me the quick hold, and then the E6000 will make sure that it stays permanent. Like I mentioned before, I really like the look of these candle holders on their own, so the only thing I needed to do was cut down a few pieces of floral foam to fit inside. I'm using some hot glue on the bottom just to make sure that they don't wiggle around. Once those were in place, I just used a little bit of green moss to cover up that foam. I was really hoping I had some of the brown Spanish moss on hand, because I think that would have looked really cute with this coastal feel, but the green moss does the trick too. Anytime I'm using moss and hot glue, I always am really careful, because even though you think you add a bit of moss to your hot glue, it always seems to seep through. So just be really careful when you're doing this so that you don't get any of that hot glue on your fingers. Once I had all of my floral foam covered up, then I just needed to stick my fishes down in. I did make sure that I pushed them the whole way in so that they would be more stable and secure. These pineapple drinking cups from the Dollar Tree really caught my eye, and I wanted to turn them into some fun solar lights. Now, I do want to give you a warning. If you go to the Dollar Tree and you find these cups, I would not recommend actually using them for drinking, because as you can see here, the leaves that are on there and the straw are permanently attached into the lid of the cup. So I think if you were actually going to use these to drink, they would be really hard to clean. You'd have to wet those leaves down and try to get that straw clean. So I think these are great for a DIY, but not really great for drinking. I grabbed 2 of the solar lights from the Dollar Tree also. They have a bunch of different finishes on the top, but I just went with the regular gray color. To get started on my pineapple solar lights, I'm using some white chalk paint, and I'm doing a really thick coat all over the surface of my pineapple. I really took my time here because it is such a textured surface. I wanted to make sure that I got paint all over it and there wouldn't be any gaps and you wouldn't see any of the yellow coming through my white paint. After my first coat of paint had dried, I wanted to add a second coat, but instead of going back and forth and creating more brush strokes, I'm using a larger sort of chippy brush and I'm just pouncing it up and down on top of my pineapple. This will help eliminate some of the brush strokes from the first coat, and it'll also help give it more of a ceramic or plaster look since this is a chalk paint. I needed to use the lid on my pineapple so that I could attach my solar light, but because that straw was stuck in there, I had to cut the straw out, but then once I did, I was able to remove those leaves from the straw so that I could use those also. Now the hole that's in the lid of the pineapple cup is not big enough to fit the base of the solar light through. So I just took my utility knife and I just started going around making small cuts, and I was able to make that hole a little bit wider. This would have been a lot easier if I would have had a hot knife. It would have melted right through that plastic, but I was able to get the job done with just my utility knife. I wanted to use the leaves that came with the cup for on my solar lights, but I wasn't able to fit the light through the hole that's on the leaves, so I just used my scissors and I cut an X shape over the circle that was already there. It kind of looks like the X that you see on top of a fast food cup that you stick your straw through. Then I was able to put all of the pieces back together. I took the stake out of the solar light because it was too tall for the size of the pineapple. And then I ran the leaves up over the bottom of the solar light and pushed the whole thing through the top of my lid. And then on the underside, I added a little hot glue to hold everything in place. Now, because I added the solar light to the lid of this cup, it was going to make it a bit top heavy. And since I am going to keep these outside, I wanted to make sure that they wouldn't topple over in the wind. So I have some old decorative rocks laying around in this container, and I just added a good handful to the bottom of each cup to make sure that it was heavy enough. And then all I had to do was screw the top of the lid back onto my pineapple for my pineapple themed solar lights. Another wood item that I can always find at the Dollar Tree are their mini wooden crates. Now, I have noticed that they've gotten a little bit smaller over the years, but I still have a bunch in my stash that I need to use up. I'm going to use one of those wooden crates today, and then I also have a wooden frame with a tin board center. I'm not even sure if you can actually add magnets to this. It doesn't show it on the picture that's in the corner, so I don't think this is magnetic. I haven't tried it out, but we're not going to need to use magnets for the command center that I'm creating today. Now, I'm not going to do anything with that frame. I like the color that's on the wood frame already, but I do want to add a pop of color to the wood crate. So I'm using a dark blue chalk paint. This one's called Nautical, and I gave my crate one coat on the outside and the inside. While my paint was drying, I got to work creating a scrappy bow for at the top of my frame. I've made these on my channel before, but if you've never made one, they're super easy, and even if you don't feel confident in your bow making skills, this is the place to start. I gathered up a bunch of my ribbons that were either blue and white or a combination of the two, and I'm cutting these down to about 7-inch lengths. So for every ribbon that I have, I cut 2 pieces at 7 inches. For these wider ribbons, I cut the ends into a dovetail shape, and for some of my thinner ribbons, I only cut those to a point on the ends just so that they weren't blunt. Now, I gathered up a bunch of different textures and colors, but they were all in the blue and white family. After I had a pile of ribbons cut, I laid a piece of jute cord down on my work surface, and starting with my smallest ribbons or my thinnest ribbons, I started laying them in an X pattern over top of my jute. Now, any of the ribbons that had a print to them, say they were only printed on one side, I made sure that I laid the printed side down because that's actually going to be the front of the bow. So I wanted to make sure that you could see that print from the front. And I did work my way from the thinnest ribbon out towards the widest ribbon. Once I had everything laid down in place in that X pattern, then all I had to do was gather up both edges of that jute twine and made sure that it fit through the X on each side, and I just tied it in the middle, which cinched it, and then I gave it a double knot to hold everything in place. And like I said, this is a super easy bow, especially for beginner crafters, or if you just don't feel like fidgeting with bows. I think this is a really easy way to do it, and it's a great way to use up some of the ribbons that you probably already have in your stash. You could place this bow anywhere you want on this frame, but I decided to keep mine at the top and the center, and I just used a little bit of hot glue to hold that in place. Since I already had a big bow at the top of my frame, I didn't want to add another bow to my crate, but I did have this pack of stickers in my stash that are themed around camping, and since this is going in my camper, I thought this would be perfect. I found one of the stickers that fit great across the front of my crate. It just says adventure, and it has some mountains behind it, and I thought the colors worked really well with the blue in the crate. I wanted to glue the center section of the crate on the bottom of the frame, but that was going to leave a little bit of a gap between the top of the crate and the tin part of the frame. So to fill in that gap, I just cut down 2 regular size craft sticks. I was able to hot glue those together, and then in order to attach that spacer to the frame, I did a combination of E6000 and hot glue on the back of the craft sticks, and then I was able to use just hot glue to attach my crate to my frame. There's a lot of different ways you can customize this command center to fit your needs, but 2 things that I knew I needed for sure in our camper were a hook for extra camper keys and a notepad, particularly one with post-it notes, because it seems like we are always looking for paper to write something down. So at the Dollar Tree, I went and grabbed a pack of their version of command hooks. This is just going to hold a small set of keys, so I didn't need it to hold a lot of weight. And then over in the post-it note section, I grabbed one of their taller post-it notes that's actually lined like a notepad. I put the command hook up under the bow just a little bit so that it would be out of the way. And then when I went to go put on my post-it notepad, I realized that the back of the notepad didn't have a cardboard backer. It was just another piece of paper. I felt that was going to be a little bit too flimsy. I wanted it to be a bit more sturdy on when I went to attach it to the board. So I grabbed an old tissue box that happened to be on the top of my garbage can, and I just cut a small piece of cardboard out to fit onto the back of the notepad. And then I just used some double-sided tape to attach the cardboard to the back of the notepad, and then I used more double-sided tape to attach it to the frame. I went to the Dollar Tree and I got a few more essentials for inside of my command center. I picked up a pencil cup that fit inside of that wooden crate. I also grabbed a pack of pens, a pair of scissors, a couple Sharpies, some pencils, and even one of their small flashlights. These were just the things that I knew we needed in our camper that we didn't have in there already, and we always seem to be searching for. So the great thing about this is you can customize this to whatever your needs are, whether it's for a camper or just in your house. I wanted to show you how well that mesh pencil cup fit inside of that wooden crate, and then everything else fit in it great too. Now, because I'm hanging this up in my camper, I am going to use some command strips on the back side of my frame to hang this up. But if you wanted to hang this up in your house on your refrigerator maybe, you could use some magnetic strips and just attach it right to your fridge. Now that spring is here, I'm really inspired to add more greenery and florals to my home decor, and these planters are a perfect way to do that. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 packs of these bamboo rings. There's 2 different sizes in here. I'm only going to use the smaller one today, but with both packs, you could make 2 different size planters. I'm also using a pack of the craft sticks from the Dollar Tree, and I'm going to use a few wooden beads that I already have on hand to act as feet. I wanted to create a base for my bottom ring first. I could have used cardboard here or chipboard or anything just to be able to set a plant on, but I thought since I had this whole pack of craft sticks, I may as well use them up. And the craft sticks were a perfect fit. They fit exactly across the center of these smaller rings. So I just started gluing around the edges of the ring. I started laying my craft sticks on. You can see the one in the middle there. It fit just perfectly from end to end. And then as I worked my way down to one end, it started to overlap, and that was okay because after I had all of the craft sticks on, I went through with my utility knife and just started cutting off the excess. These craft sticks are pretty thin that you get from the Dollar Tree, so it was pretty easy to cut through these. And I always find that it's easier to make a few light passes rather than trying to cut through the whole stick at once. So I'm just taking my utility knife here and I'm making a few passes just to get the excess off. And remember, this is the bottom of the planter. You're not actually going to be able to see it. I just thought this was a neat way to use up some craft sticks rather than cutting a piece of cardboard. After all the excess was cut off, I did go through with a sanding block and just remove any sharp edges just to make sure that I didn't get any splinters. When I need to cut a bunch of craft sticks down to the same length, I always like to use my paper trimmer. So I'm using those same craft sticks from the Dollar Tree. I'm cutting the rounded edge off of one side, and then I'm just measuring out 5 inches and cutting it again so that my planter will be 5 inches tall. Putting this plant holder together was really simple. I just started adding hot glue to the base piece that I had created on the outside of the ring, and I just lined my craft stick up. You can see I have my silicone mat here. This just helps protect my work surface, and it also helps make sure that I can line up the bottom of the craft stick with the bottom of the ring. Once I had a few rings in place, then I went through and I hot glued the other end to the second ring so that I could space these out a little bit more evenly. Once I had a few of the craft sticks hot glued onto one side of my plant holder, I jumped over to the other side because I noticed that it had started to droop, so this just made it a little bit easier to keep it even on both sides. So I'm doing the same thing on this second side here. I'm just adding hot glue to the bottom ring and the top ring, and I'm holding my craft stick in place there. I kept my craft sticks fairly close together. That's the main difference between this one and the one on the Kirkland's website. The Kirkland's ones, the vertical pieces were a little bit farther apart, so it's up to you how you decide to do yours. But I like the look of mine with the craft sticks a little bit closer together. Here's where you can decide what will fit your home's decor the best. For me, I really like the look of the natural wood, but I also like that distressed look. So I'm taking some white chalk paint here and I'm just dry brushing over the surface, leaving some of that wood show through. You could buy fancier feet for your plant stand, but I'm all about using up what I already have. And since I already had these white wooden beads on hand, I just hot glued these to the bottom. Peel and stick wallpaper really comes in handy when you don't have a ton of time to craft. From the plus section of my Dollar Tree, I grabbed a 2-pack of these 11 by 14 stretched canvases. I'm only going to use one for today's project, so I'll save the other one for something else. I also went over to the Crafter Square section and I got one of their regular 8 by 10 stretch canvases. And then in my stash, I had this wooden letter M. I think this might have came from Walmart, but it might have come from Michael's. I'm not sure. And it's about 5 inches high. I chose the letter M because that's what my last name starts with, but you could use anything you'd like, or you don't even have to use a letter at all. You could put whatever you want in the center of your pictures. For my letter M, I just gave it 2 quick coats of white chalk paint. While my paint was drying, I cut my peel and stick wallpaper down so that I had 2 pieces, one that was 1 inch smaller than the smaller canvas. So for example, my 8 by 10 canvas, I cut that piece of wallpaper down to 7 by 9. And for the 11 by 14 canvas, I cut that piece down to 10 by 13. Now the back side of this wallpaper is pretty sticky, but I really wanted to make sure that it would stick well to this canvas material because of the coating that's on it. I wasn't sure how well that adhesive would hold up. So once I had my piece of wallpaper centered within my canvas, I'm using my art glitter glue here on the back side just to make sure that it was more sticky. Once I had it in place, I flipped it over and burnished it down with my hand just to make sure that that glue had a chance to set and sink in. And it's easier to push it from the back side than from the front side because of how the canvas is stretched across the frame. So you can see here again with the bigger canvas, I'm doing the same thing. I just laid my peel and stick wallpaper on top of it and made sure that it was centered within the canvas. Then I lifted half of it up, added some of my my art glitter glue to one side, laid the paper down, put a little more art glitter glue on the other side, and then I flipped the whole thing over to really give it a good press to make sure that that glue was nice and adhered down. Now that my paint is all dry, I'm just going to use hot glue to put everything together. So I put a generous amount on the back side of my letter M. I centered it within the smaller of the two canvases, and again I made sure that I flipped it over and pressed it from the back side so that it would have a chance to set in place. And I think that looks pretty just how it is, but I think stacking the two canvases together really elevated the look a bit. So again, on the smaller canvas, I'm adding hot glue to the back side of the smaller one, and then I centered it within the bigger one. And once I had it centered, I flipped the whole thing over so that I could give it a press from the back side so that I wasn't putting any pressure on that canvas material. And like I said, you don't have to add a monogram to yours. I think another pretty option would be to create a small wreath and put that in the middle. I love succulents, and I love how big this succulent holder from Kirkland's is. It measures about 12 by 12. For this project, I just needed 2 packs of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree, and these were the bigger boxes, the one that has 72 in it. I needed to create the 4 walls for my planner to start, so I'm using a T-square here and my big silicone mat just to help prevent any hot glue from getting on my surface. I started by lining up 6 of the tumbling tower blocks and just gluing them in a straight line. Now I wanted to bricklay my tumbling tower blocks because I am going to make each wall of my planter about 4 rows high. So there's a couple different ways you could cut these tumbling tower blocks. I have these miter shears that I get from Amazon, and they will cut through them, but it does take a good bit of hand strength to get the blocks cut. If you don't think you could use something like that, you could use just a regular handsaw and a miter box to cut these blocks in half. Or if you wanted to avoid cutting these at all, you could just create 4 rows of 6 blocks and not bricklay them. They could just line up on top of each other. I think either way it would look good. I just really wanted to try out the bricklay pattern, and I wanted to see if I could really cut through these blocks with my miter shears. So for the second row on this wall, you can see I laid one of my half blocks down, and then I laid 5 full blocks down and my other half block on the other end. That way when I stack the 2 rows together, it'll bricklay the Jenga blocks from each other. And like I said, I need 4 rows for each wall of my planter. So that means I need about 24 blocks for each side. So you'll need 96 blocks altogether. That's why I had 2 packs of the tumbling tower blocks there. And I got my 3rd row done here. Now I'm just using hot glue on these. You could use wood glue if you wanted to, but I always have pretty good luck with the Gorilla Glue sticks. They seem to hold wood pretty well. I've not really had anything fall apart on mine when I'm just using the glue sticks on the wood. So again, on the 4th row for the wall of my block, I'm just cutting one of the Jenga blocks in half. Now these Jenga blocks are just slightly smaller than 2 inches, so I cut my blocks down to about 1 inch in size. And again, I did the same thing with the 4th row. I started with one of the half blocks. I glued down 5 of the full blocks, and then I put another half block on the opposite end. After I had all 4 rows of my tumbling tower blocks assembled, then I could go through with my hot glue and glue the 4 rows together. I started with one of the rows that had the 6 whole blocks in it, and then on top of that I laid one of the rows that had the half blocks. And then I repeated that again for rows 3 and 4. Now like I said, I chose to make my box 4 rows high, but it's up to you how high you want to make yours. You could make this higher or shorter. Either way it would look good. Also, try not to stress about the rows being a little uneven or there being some gaps in between some of the blocks. I just think that adds to the uniqueness of a handmade planter. Once I had all 4 walls of my box assembled, I wanted to give it a little more stability. So on the back side of each of my walls, I'm just taking some craft sticks and I ran them on a diagonal just to hold most of the blocks together. I'm using my T-square again here to help line up the walls of my box. I'm using the same Gorilla Glue hot glue sticks to put everything together. And you can see I lined the first two up first. And the key that I found to make sure that this was nice and sturdy is to really hold those two pieces in place while the glue sets. If you move on too fast, that glue is going to be warm and you run the risk of having the two pieces come apart. So once that was set in place, then I just moved it over to the other side, and using some hot glue again, I just glued on the third wall, and then I repeated that again for the fourth wall. Once all four sides of my box were put together, I wanted to reinforce those corners a bit more. So on the inside of the box where the two pieces met, I added a generous amount of hot glue just to give it more stability and make sure that my box was nice and sturdy. I did that in all four corners of my box. If you wanted to take the time to create a bottom for your box out of some more of the tumbling tower blocks, you could do that. But I wanted to make mine a bit simple, so I'm just using a piece of heavyweight chipboard and I cut it down to fit my box. I used a little bit of hot glue just to glue it onto the bottom. And once again, for added stability, I went through and added a good amount of hot glue where the chipboard and the bottom of the box met. Before going through and adding my succulents to my box, I took some white chalk paint and I gave a pretty heavy coat. I let a little bit of the wood show through, but I mostly wanted it to be white. And I really like once I added the paint that you could really see the seams in between each of the blocks. I think it just gave this box a nice character. Now, because this box is so big, it measures about 12 inches by 12 inches, I had to use a lot of floral foam in it. And then I also covered up that foam with some moss. You can see most of the floral foam that I had were scrap pieces that I had laying around, which actually worked out perfect to get those out of my stash. But when I show you the finished picture, you'll see that I did add a pretty good amount onto my finished piece. I think I did an extra $20 just because if you didn't have floral foam laying around and if you didn't have a lot of succulents in your craft stash, that would cost a good bit of money to get this box filled because it is so big. But even though I did have to spend that extra cost getting the floral foam and the succulents in there, it's still a lot cheaper than if I would have bought the Kirkland's version. You may have noticed that I have a set of books covered in craft paper that I use a lot when I'm staging photos. I wanted to create another set, but I wanted it to have a coastal twist. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 3 hardcover books, all the same. And the reason I picked these books specifically is because the cover itself has shades of blue on it. So even if a little bit of that peeks out, it'll still fit in with the coastal theme. I also grabbed a roll of the craft paper and a pack of these starfish. I did cut some letters out using my Cricut, but you could use scrapbook stickers instead. And I'll also be using some jute twine. I'm using the dust jacket that came with the book to create a pattern for my new cover. I laid it on top of my roll of craft paper, traced it out with a pen, and then cut it down with scissors. You don't have to worry about being too precise here because once I had my cover cut out, then I took my paper and I rolled it up into a ball. I really wanted this paper to have a weathered, distressed look, so I kept crinkling it until it had some nice wrinkles in it and it broke down some of the fiber in the paper. I laid my book on top of the paper and then I just folded up each edge over the front and back covers of the book. I did this with all 3 of my books. Once they were all covered, then I started in with some of my white chalk paint and I wanted to give the edges a little more distressing. For the first book, I went around the edges on all of the sides of the book, but then I did go through and add a little bit more of the white chalk paint to the top of the book because this was going to be the book that is sitting on top of the other 2. For the other 2 books, I just needed to go around the edges. This was the only one that needed paint on the surface. After my paint had a chance to dry, then I started gluing my 3 books together. I laid one down, added a little bit of hot glue to the top cover, put the middle one in place, and then repeated it, and I made sure that my top book was the one that I had painted on the surface. Then I moved on to gluing on my letters. Now I cut my letters out with my Cricut and I just used plain white cardstock here. If you have a Cricut, you could use vinyl if you wanted to. I just didn't feel like wasting any vinyl for just a few letters. And if you don't have a Cricut at all, don't worry. These letters are pretty small. I think I sized these to about 3/4 of an inch. So you could easily find these in the scrapbook section of Michael's or probably even the Dollar Tree too. I think they might sell alphabet letters there. So my words spell out sea, sand, and sun, and I just put one word on each book, slightly over to the right side of each book. I wanted to wrap the left side of my books with some jute twine. So on the bottom side of the books, I laid down a little bit of hot glue, covered that twine with some clear tape, and then I just started wrapping it around. Normally I like the twine to crisscross back and forth, but I didn't want to create too much bulk under the book so that it would lay flatter. So I just took my time and I kept wrapping slowly so that all of my twine would be laying next to each other. And I didn't mind if there was some gaps in between the twine. I thought that looked kind of neat. Once I had as much twine on as I wanted, then on the bottom side again, I just used some hot glue and a longer piece of clear tape that went the whole way across all of my strands. As a final touch, I just hot glued my starfish to the left side of the book. And one tip I have, if you decide to do this, just make sure the bottom of the starfish is lined up with the bottom of the book so it lays okay. At $38, these pillar candle holders were a little too expensive for me. So from the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 of the glass bowls, and I also picked out 2 glass vases that fit at the base of the bowls. The best way to attach a piece of glass to another piece of glass is by using the E6000 hot glue combo. So once again, I'm adding E6000 around the base of the vase and a little bit of hot glue in the center, and then I'm just placing the bowl on top of it. I'm taking advantage of the warm weather and I'm spray painting as much as I can. So for these pieces, I'm using a paint by Rust-Oleum, and this is a high gloss finish in the color white. I think this paint has such a good coverage. I was able to get away with just doing 1 coat of this paint. I wanted to test out my painter's tape before I started putting it on for the color blocking. So inside the bowl, I laid a piece of tape down and I rubbed it fairly hard to make sure that it wouldn't pull up any of that spray paint before I started moving on to the body of the vase. Now I did let this spray paint dry for almost a full day just to make sure that it had a really good coverage and that it wouldn't lift up by the tape. I wanted to kind of mimic the pattern that was on the Kirkland's vase, so I just started laying my tape down in a diagonal pattern until I had it blocked off how I thought I would like it. And for the second vase, because I knew there was no way I was going to match up and have it be exactly the same, I did the same pattern, but I moved it down lower on the vase so that when they were sitting side by side, they would look like they went together, but they weren't going to be exactly the same. So you can see the second vase, the pattern is the same, but it's much lower on the vase, so I didn't have to stress about getting them exact. Now, the great thing about DIYing your own home decor is you can change up the colors to however you liked. So for mine, I wanted to give mine a green bottom rather than the peach color that the Kirkland's had. And because I wanted to add a little more texture to mine, I'm actually using chalk paint for the base of mine rather than another high gloss paint, because I really like the look of that matte flat chalk paint up against the high gloss spray paint. So for my first coat of chalk paint, I'm taking my time and I'm pulling downward from the paint tape line so that I decrease the risk of having any of that paint seep up through the tape. I was just pulling it down to make sure that it was nice and even and nothing was going up underneath it. After my first coat of chalk paint had dried, I went back in with a second coat, and I really wanted to even out some of the brush strokes that I could see from that first coat. So I'm using a chippy brush here, and rather than painting it on in strokes like I did the first coat, I'm going in an up and down motion, kind of like you're stippling on if you're going to do a stencil or something like that. This just helps even out any of the brush strokes that you might see, and it's also going to give a little bit of extra texture because some of that texture from pouncing it on there is going to stay even after the paint dries. So once I had the whole thing covered with my second coat of paint, I went ahead and removed that painter's tape. And because I had really taken my time with that first coat, making sure that I was pulling away from the tape rather than going up towards it, I had a nice crisp line on my vase. Peel and stick wallpaper is a great way to customize a plain composition notebook. Now, I wouldn't buy one at the Dollar Tree because they are $1.25, and at Walmart you can find them for under $1, especially during back to school sales. I already had a composition notebook in my stash because I love to make these to give as gifts, and I also grabbed 2 of the sheets of the peel and stick wallpaper in this really pretty wood grain. To make this quick and easy, for the first sheet of wallpaper, since it does measure 11 by 16, I just put it in my paper trimmer and I cut it down to 8 inches. So now I have 2 pieces that are 8 by 11. When I cover composition notebooks, I never wrap anything around the binding of the book because that's where you open and close it, and I'm always afraid it's going to get wrinkled and come apart. So I took some double-sided tape, and from where that binding ends on the cover, I just ran 1 piece of tape there just to add a little more security for when I'm placing down my wallpaper. After I took the backing off of my tape, then I peeled back some of the backing on the wallpaper. It comes in 2 sections. That's how they make it, so it's a little bit easier to peel off. And you can see here, I'm just peeling back a little bit and folding that backer back, so I'm only exposing part of the sticky side. Then I'm doing my best to center it across the front of the notebook, lining it up with that binding strip. And when I had it in place, I had a little overhang at the top and bottom, which is great for covering a notebook. So then I was able to peel off the backer slowly so that I could smooth it out as I was pulling it off, and there were no bubbles as I stuck it down. Now you can see here that there's an overhang at the top, at the bottom, and at the side of the cover. And I'm just using a bone folder here to really burnish that wallpaper down to make sure that it has a good adhesion. Before I moved on to folding those edges in, I did want to take off some of the bulk at the corners. So with my scissors, I'm just cutting straight across the corner, leaving about 1/4 of an inch from the cover. Once I had those corners cut off, then I could just fold my paper over to the inside. And don't worry, I know there's stuff printed on the inside cover of this notebook, but I'm going to cover that up later. So you can see here, I just started at the top and the bottom, and I folded those pieces down and I smoothed them out with my bone folder. Then I got to the side section and folded that in also. Now you can see that leaves us with a sharp corner here, and these notebook corners are rounded. So all I'm going to do is push down on that corner a bit so that I can see the shape a little bit better. And then I'm just going to go through with my scissors and I'm going to cut off the same shape of the notebook, leaving a rounded corner on both sides. The process for covering the back cover was the same as the front. I did everything exactly the same on the back side that I did on the front side. And like I mentioned before, I do love to make these covered composition books to give as gifts, and it's a great way to customize it for whoever you're giving it to. You can put their name on it, you could put different quotes or different things that they like on the cover. You could decorate it any way that you think the recipient would like. I've also made a lot of these in the past for different craft fairs, and they've always been big sellers for me because you can get them fairly cheap during back to school sales, and then the materials that you use to cover them don't cost a lot. You don't have to charge a lot, which is something that a lot of people look for when they're at a craft fair. Since we are in July now, this is a good time to start thinking about Christmas because so many people are putting out Christmas in July videos. And even though this technically isn't a Christmas craft, this is something you could keep in mind if you wanted to give some handmade gifts for Christmas this year. And with the back to school sales starting now, you could stock up on these notebooks and get to work and start crafting now so that you're not so stressed for the holidays. Now that my front and back covers are done, I wanted to cut some pieces to cover up the inside of the covers. So I took some measurements on mine. Now I would say definitely measure for whatever notebook you're using because they're probably going to be all just a little bit different. For the one that I'm using, I ended up cutting a piece down to 7 by 9.5. But like I said, definitely measure your own notebook so that you know what kind of measurement you need to cover the inside. And you also don't want to place your ruler the whole way into the binding because you need a little bit of room for the cover to be able to open and close. I showed you those lines in the center of the wood grain there because as I'm cutting it down to 9.5, I wanted to make sure that those lines stayed centered in my page. That's why I'm cutting 2 small pieces off of each end rather than just cutting it to 9.5. But depending on what kind of pattern you're using, you probably don't have to be that particular. I just wanted to make sure that my lines stayed center. Before laying down my inside piece, I wanted to make sure that those corners would line up with the rounded corners. I didn't bother, making it exact. I knew I just needed the corner to be a little bit rounded so that it would fit nice into the notebook corner. And the same thing like we did on the front, I just peeled back part of the backing. I lined it up on the inside. There's a small border that runs around the outside there. And then I peeled the rest of the backer off as I was smoothing it out so that I had a nice finished look on the inside. And then I used my bone folder again once I had it all stuck down so that I could give it a good burnish and make sure that the paper was nice and adhered. And just like before, the back cover is done the same as the front cover. I repeated all the same steps, just doing it on the back side. Now I know I don't do a whole lot of paper crafts here on my channel, but it's something I really do enjoy doing. You'll have to let me know in the comments if you're a paper crafter or if you're interested in paper crafting, because I would definitely love to keep doing more paper craft videos because I have a ton of scrapbook paper in my stash that I'd like to start using up. There's a lot of options at the Dollar Tree for decorating these notebooks. They always have a big selection of stickers and rub-on transfers, but I actually went to the greeting card section and I found this really cute greeting card with a typewriter on it that says "Choose Happy." I just really loved the image and I thought it would look great on this notebook. On the inside of this greeting card, there's also a really nice message that I wanted to use somewhere else on my notebook too. I started by cutting the greeting card in half so that I could just work with the front cover to start. There was a lot of extra white space on this card, so I took a quick measurement and I just cut some of the excess off the bottom so that it wouldn't cover up too much of the front of my notebook. Once I had that cut down, then I moved on to a piece of black cardstock and I cut it about 1/4 of an inch bigger going in both directions to act as a mat for underneath the image. This isn't really necessary because this does have a solid white background, but I do like to mat it. I think it just gives it a really nice look. Plus it kind of helps tie in the black binding on the notebook into the black matte border. I'm using the art glitter glue here to attach my image to my mat. You can see here that I rounded the corners of both of these. That's not necessary, but if you do have a corner rounder, I think it just gives it a little bit more interest. Now, one thing you want to keep in mind when you're decorating notebooks is that you don't want to add too much dimension to the front because as you open it and write on it, if there's a lot of beads or gems or anything like that on the front, it's going to kind of create an uneven surface. So as you're writing, that can be just a little bit annoying. So I would try to keep it as flat as possible on the front. And you can see here that image just looks so great with that wood grain on the cover. I also cut out that little quote that was on the inside of the card and I mounted that on some black cardstock, and I'm just placing that at the bottom of the back cover. I love using risers in my home's decor, and when I saw this one on the Kirkland's website, I love that it was a black galvanized metal rather than the traditional gray. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed a pack of the stove covers. There's 2 in a pack in 2 different sizes. And then in the glassware section, I browsed around until I found a glass that I liked to act as the base of my riser. Since there were two different sizes of stove covers in this pack, I tested out both of them with my glass to see which one I liked better, but in the end I decided to go with the bigger one. Now, because this is a metal stove cover and I'm adhering it to a piece of glass, I'm going to be using my E6000 glue and some hot glue for that long-term, short-term hold. In my last video, I got a lot of questions about this key that I have on my E6000 tube. I get these from Amazon. They're fairly inexpensive, and it makes using the E6000 a lot easier because you can twist it down like you would a tube of toothpaste, and then once you have the glue out that you need, you just twist it backwards a little bit, and it helps suck that glue back up in so it doesn't create a mess, which, you know, if you've used E6000 before, those tubes are notorious for just oozing and oozing and oozing. So being able to suck it back in really makes a big difference. So once I had both of my glues on my glass, I turned my stove cover upside down, and it was easier for me to work with the glass being pressed down onto the stove cover rather than the other way around, and I just did my best to make sure that it was in the center. I already had this black chalkboard paint on hand, but any type of matte black paint will work for this project. You could use spray paint like I am, or you could use chalk paint. Anything that has a matte finish is what you want to use as your first layer. You can see here that I have a nice even coverage all over my riser. I was lucky I got away with just doing one coat of that spray paint. To create that galvanized look, I cut a piece of sponge, and on the one end, I ripped some of the pieces off so that it wouldn't have a perfectly square shape to it. It would have a little bit more of a texture. The second layer of paint that I'm going to do on my riser is also a black color, but it's a metallic finish. This one's by Decor Art. I got it from Michael's, and the color is called Obsidian. I started applying that paint with that sponge that I had cut up, and as I was putting it all over the surface, I tried to turn it in a few different directions so that it didn't look like just squares all over the surface of the riser. Now, I have to say, I love how this paint job came out. I love that tone on tone black galvanized look. I think it's just such a cool looking riser. I really want to try painting it on a bunch of different things. And one tip I have is if you are a person that maybe sets up at craft fairs or things like that, this would be a great way to display some of your items. I think it would give it such a unique look at your booth if you had a bunch of different risers and boxes and shelves and things all with this black galvanized paint job. I think it would look really eye-catching at a craft fair. These really cute trivets made out of clothespins popped up on my Pinterest page, and I knew I wanted to make some for my camper. Now, I'll leave a link to this blog down below since this wasn't my original idea, but I just wanted to show you my twist on it. Check the packaging for the clothespins when you're at the Dollar Tree, because for some reason, some of the packages had 54 clothespins in them and some of them only had 32, and they're the same price. So make sure you grab the bigger pack while you're there. Each of my trivets only needed 23 clothespins, so out of one pack of 54, I was able to get 2 trivets. I started by taking a bunch of the clothespins out of the pack, and I just gave one of them a twist, and it helped pop that spring out because you want to take these clothespins apart in order to create the trivet. So this takes a little bit of time taking all of the little springs out of the clothespins, but like I said, you'll need 23 for each trivet, and I found it was easier just to get it all over with in the beginning so that I could move on to gluing my clothespins together. I'm using a combination of wood glue and hot glue to glue these clothespins together, and I like to do it assembly line style. So I have 5 clothespins lined up. I applied my wood glue first, and then I went through with my hot glue gun and just added a dot to the top and bottom. And then I sandwiched on another clothespin, and these are going back to back to create this pointed shape. So like I said, I like to do this like an assembly line. I start by putting all my wood glue on a few, and then I go through it with my hot glue and get all those together. And this just helps it go a little bit quicker for me. Once I had a few of these little clothespin bundles created, then I started attaching them to each other. And I'm using the same wood glue, hot glue combo again. This time I laid my silicone mat down because I knew I needed it on a surface as I was gluing them together so that it would stay flat. Now, because of the pointed shape of the clothespin bundles, this is what will help form that circle. You don't have to worry about putting any kind of curve in or anything like that. As long as you line all of the tips up, it'll start curving on its own. So you can see once I had a good many of my clothespin bundles glued together at the tips, it formed this circular pattern that we're going to use for our trivet. And then when I got to my last little clothespin bundle, I had to apply wood glue and hot glue to both sides of it so that I could slide it right in between. Now, like I said, I used my silicone mat here because I really wanted this to lay flat, and I knew some of the glue was going to ooze out from the other side, and this just protected my work surface. This probably isn't necessary, but I really wanted to make sure that this wasn't going to fall apart. So on the underside of my trivet, I added a generous amount of wood glue where all of those points came in towards the center. And then I used a sponge brush to brush it out towards the outside and make sure that it was really pushed down in. Now, there's a couple different ways you can decorate these trivets. Now, like I said before, I really like the color of natural wood, but I wanted a couple things in my camper to add some color. So I decided to paint mine gray and blue because those are kind of the accents colors that I have throughout my camper. I'm just using chalk paint here. If you think that you're going to use these trivets and just take your pots directly from the stove and put it right on the trivet, you probably don't want to paint it or seal it or anything like that. I was reading a blog post where somebody else made a pair of these trivets and they just left the natural wood and they bought cutting board oil to seal in their trivets, and they were able to take pots directly off the stove and put it right on there. So if you're going to be painting or decorating these like I am, you'll probably want to let your pots cool down for just a minute or two before you move them to your trivets. To add a little decoration to my trivets, I grabbed a paper doily out of my stash and I'm going to use that as a stencil. Now my trivets dried overnight, so the paint is good and dry on these now. I added a little bit of washi tape to the back side of my doily and I placed it in the center of the trivet. Then I went in with some white chalk paint. I brushed most of the excess off so that there wasn't too much on my brush, and then I just pounced it up and down all around the outside edges of the doily, making sure that I got that pattern on there and also a little bit of paint around the outside of the doily too. And then because I used the washi tape to hold it in place, it was able to just peel back up and reveal the pattern that was left on my trivet. Since I am aware that I won't be able to put boiling hot pots right on top of these painted trivets, I did want to give it one quick coat of Mod Podge though, just to seal all of that paint in and to protect it a little bit. I'm using the matte finish Mod Podge because I really like the matte finish of the chalk paint, but you can choose to use whatever you'd like. I've made these crisscross ribbon wreaths on my channel before, but I didn't have one for summer. So from the Dollar Tree, I grabbed 2 of their 14-inch wire wreath forms. I got 3 packs of grosgrain ribbon, but there's actually 15 feet in each roll, so I only needed 2 of these. And then I also grabbed 2 of their orange stems. They had a bunch of different fruit-themed stems this year in their flower department that I thought were so cute, and a couple other bunches of flowers. I was a little disappointed with the wreath forms at the Dollar Tree. I usually have some of these in my stash, but I was all out, so I had to get 2 new ones. And for whatever reason, all of the ones that they had at my Dollar Tree, the crossbars on the wreath were sticking really far out from the edges of the wreath, and I knew that would be a problem. So if your wreath forms are a little bit better quality, you won't have to do this step, but I did have to take my wire cutters and just snip off the excess around the outside so that those weren't sticking out. Then I needed to connect my 2 wreath forms together so that it would make more of a rounded shape on both sides. I always use the crossbar section as my point of reference when I'm attaching my 2 wreath forms. I use a little bit of hot glue right where those crossbars meet up just to hold that wreath in place temporarily. Then I use a piece of jute twine or a piece of yarn, anything that I have on hand, just to give it a quick tie right where those two bars meet. And I repeated that the whole way around at each intersection just to hold my two wreaths together. After both of my wreaths are connected, I start at one of those intersection points, and on the back side I add some hot glue and I put my ribbon over it. Then I just start winding my ribbon on a slight diagonal the whole way around the wreath. Every time I come to one of those intersection points, that's where I add more hot glue. I don't ever feel the need to add hot glue every time I wrap the ribbon around. So having those intersection points as a guide is a really great way to add your hot glue. And like I said, I am going on an angle and I'm trying to keep the spacing in between the ribbon as evenly as possible. I usually get about 6 wraps in between each section. Once I have my ribbon wrapped the whole way around the wreath going in one direction, then at the same point that I ended, I start again and I go back through wrapping in the other direction so that my ribbon crosses over the first row of ribbon that I added. So again, I do the same thing every time I come to an intersection. That's where I add more hot glue, and I try to keep my ribbon as spaced out as evenly as possible, making sure that it crosses over that first wrap. After I have my whole wreath wrapped in my ribbon, I try to look for the section where maybe the ribbon didn't get quite as evenly spaced out, and that's usually where I'll concentrate all of my decorations. So you can see here on the bottom side of this wreath, that's kind of where the ribbon got a little bit wacky and was a little bit more spread out. So that's where I decided to add my fruits and my florals. To get prepped to decorate my wreath, I clipped off the extra stem that was on the bottom bunches of those oranges, but I left them intact so that they were nice and bundled together. But I did clip apart my white flower stems so that they were individual pieces. Then those 2 orange branches that I had, I lined the bottom of the stems up together, and in the middle I added a little bit of hot glue and then secured it with some clear tape. And then because these are wired, I just started bending them so that they would fit the shape of the wreath form so that they would curve up slightly. I always like to decorate on the bottom side of my wreath, but if you prefer to do the top or the side, you can kind of make this however you like. I just always tend to decorate towards the bottom. Now that I have the shape of the orange branches how I liked it, then using some hot glue and some of that clear tape again, I just started filling in some of the gaps in between the oranges with those bunches of white flowers. And these white flowers I did get from the Dollar Tree also, and I thought they looked really good with the little oranges. Once I had everything in place on this orange and flower swag that I created, I wanted to cover up those raw edges of the stems in the center there just in case you would see them. So I took some hot glue, I added it to one side, and then I just used some jute rope and I wrapped it until I got to the other side and all of the edges of those stems were covered up. I created a simple bow for my wreath by taking a length of ribbon and looping both of the sides in towards the center. And then I cut another piece to act as a second loop so that it would have a little bit more volume. I used some jute twine to tie the 2 loops in the center, and I made sure that I had enough length on the jute twine so that I would be able to tie that around my wreath form for a little extra security. I added a little hot glue under that swag that I created for my wreath, and then once that was set, I laid the bow on top of it, and because I left those jute twine tails long enough, I was able to just wrap that jute twine around towards the back and give it a good tie to keep it in place. I did add hot glue under the jute twine so that as I tied that knot in, it would sink into the hot glue and hold it together. Rather than recreating this look from Kirkland's, I'm using it as inspiration for a wreath. From the Dollar Tree, I grabbed a pack of their brass wreath rings. This is a 3-pack and there's 3 different sizes in each pack. For Michael's, I grabbed a bag of raffia that I was going to wrap around it, but then I headed over to the gift wrap section and I was able to find this raffia paper ribbon roll. It's a little pricey at $7.49, but in the app on my phone, I had a 30% 20% off coupon, making it just $5.24. And it's a big roll. There's 75 yards on it, so I'll be able to create a lot of projects with it. To get started, I laid all 3 of my rings together on top of my silicone mat so that I could attach all of them together. I laid them out from largest to smallest, and I tucked all of them up against one side because, like I said, I'm using that piece from Kirkland's as inspiration. I'm not duping it exactly. So once I had all 3 of my rings stacked together, I cut down a piece of craft stick and I just used some hot glue, and I hot glued that over where all 3 of those rings met. And I held that in place until it was good and set. And then I flipped it over and I did the same thing on the back. I added a bunch of hot glue and laid a piece of craft stick over it so that the rings would be sandwiched in between the 2 craft sticks. I started where those 2 craft sticks were, and I just started wrapping some of this paper raffia ribbon around everything. Now, once I got to the part where all of the rings started separating, this is where I just started wrapping on the center 2 rings. So as you can see here, I cut some of the ribbon off of the roll because I wouldn't be able to fit it in between the rings. And right as they started separating away from each other, that's whenever I started wrapping just around the center 2. And I did use a little bit of hot glue here and there just to help hold that ribbon in place. And as I was wrapping the ribbon around those 2 center ones, I started spacing it out farther and farther as I got to the bottom of the rings. As I was wrapping my ribbon, I kept it on a diagonal, and you can see here that as I kept wrapping and spacing it out, it created a really cool woven pattern. And the space in between each of the wraps that I was doing was going to come in handy later when I started wrapping the second row. Also keep in mind, you don't have to use this paper raffia ribbon if you want to recreate this. I think it would look really cool too if you used any kind of regular material ribbon or even jute cord or yarn, like one of those really chunky yarns. I think that would look really cool and give it a neat boho feel. I zoomed in here so you could see how I'm going to do the second row. Again, I started out at the top where those craft sticks are, and I cut a length of this paper ribbon and just started in with my hot glue. Now, because I left those spaces on that first row, that's what I'm going to use to space out my second row, and that's how I'm going to join the 2 together. So you can see here, as I'm wrapping this around, I'm feeding it through the space on the first row, and I'm staying in that same diagonal shape so that it crisscrosses back on itself and gives it a really cool woven look. And now that it's being woven into the first row, it's really creating a neat pattern. One thing to keep in mind as you're wrapping this ribbon, or any ribbon that you choose, is just keep it really flat, and anytime that it twists, just make sure that you're twisting it back so that it lays nice and flat. As I got towards the bottom where the spacing got a little bit bigger, sometimes I would place 2 wraps inside of the first row rather than just 1. And I also wanted to show you here too, as I got to the end of my ribbon, I just added a little bit of hot glue and I laid the next ribbon right on top of it, cut another piece off, and kept weaving my way around. Weaving the second row into the first row really made this feel a lot sturdier also. Now, like I said earlier, I'm using this Kirkland's piece just as inspiration. I know that it's a freestanding piece of home decor, but I'm going to create a wreath instead. So I gathered up a couple pieces of greenery and some flowers that I had in my stash, and I just created a simple swag by clipping them all off the bunch and putting all of the stems toward the center, and I'm holding it in place with some clear tape. Then I got some striped ribbon out of my stash, and I just created a really simple 1-loop bow, and I tied that onto my swag. Now, what you could do here is just tie the bow and the swag right onto the wreath, and you could change it out for the different seasons. But because I have so much of that paper ribbon in my stash, I decided to go ahead and just glue my bow right to the top of my wreath. Thanks so much for coming to hang out with me in the craft room again today. If you need even more crafting inspiration, check out one of the videos I left on the screen. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.